Be chairing today's session, and my name is Heather McFarlane, and I work for the environmental charity Fidra. And many of you may have heard of Fidra because we run the Great Noodle Hunt. But if you haven't, please do come and look at the Noodle Hunt website, and we also have a website specifically for NGOs. And this webinar has been put on for NGOs working on plastic pollution and other environmental issues specifically, and there's lots of great resources on there. So I'll be chairing today and handing over to our speakers who are joining us from Oracle Environmental Experts. So we have Josh and Sam. But before we get started, I wanted to give you an introduction to the issue, and then we'll get on to the work that Oracle Environmental Experts have done for Fidra on mapping the global plastic pellet supply chain and what they found out and some of their key findings. And they're going to be highlighting some of the impact that acute and chronic pollution has been having as well on communities and on wildlife. And then we'll have a good chunk of time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions throughout the presentations, please could I ask you to put those in the chat. If you could keep yourself on mute until we get to the Q&A, that would be really helpful. And then when we get to the Q&A, we will try and pick up any questions that haven't been addressed through the talks. And then we will also have the chance to raise hands and have a bit of a chat as well. So that should be most of the sort of background housekeeping. So I think without further ado, I shall begin. So why are we working on Noodles? Well, Fidra, an environmental charity based in Scotland, and one of the local beaches that's going to be familiar to Joe looks a lot like this. It's covered in noodles, and this is in an area of special scientific interest, so it's important for wildlife. It's also important for the local community. If this beach wasn't covered in noodles, it could be a little tourist hotspot under the bridges, iconic bridges that we have in Scotland. And it's a really shocking case of what we're calling chronic pollution. So that's the bad news. The good news is that this is a preventable pollution. It's very clearly coming from the plastic industry. So there is a clear source, and it's very clearly industry's responsibility to stop this happening. This isn't one of those plastic issues that can be confused with a consumer issue or a waste management issue. This is very clearly the responsibility of the plastic industry. It's also a bit of an overlooked problem. There's a risk that the petrochemical industry who produce these plastic pellets or noodles aren't being held to account, and we think that needs to change. It's also, noodles are a good way to shine a spotlight on microplastic. It's a visible form of microplastic. So I've got a jar of noodles here, and they are about the size of a lentil. So you have these tiny little bits of plastic, but they are at least visible, which makes it a little bit easier to engage the public, engage press, and engage politicians in this issue. The other reason why we work on noodles is it's potentially a growing issue if plastic production does indeed increase as it's predicted to. So it's not something that's going to go away on its own, and we feel it's time that this is addressed. So exactly where is this coming from? How have we got into this situation where we have beaches covered in noodles? Well, the petrochemical industry makes noodles, but they can easily also be made out of bioplastic. And at that stage, pellets can be lost at the point that their plastic is formed into these pellets. They're then transported around the world on trucks, by rail, and also on ships. And noodles can be lost at those stages as well, and at those sort of transition points. They can also be lost when these little plastic pellets, these noodles, are melted down to make nearly all plastic products. So that means that there's a huge amount of noodles being produced and a huge chain where they can be lost. And even once plastic is potentially recycled, they can be turned back into pellets and concentrate toxic chemicals that are in the original plastic. So this means that there's potentially nurdles leaking out of every stage of the plastic pellet supply chain. And indeed, that seems to be what is happening. Fidra set up the Great Nurdle Hunt, initially focused here in Scotland. I guess we wondered how much this was a local issue, and then finding out that more and more places around the world have been impacted as well. And we've seen this sort of global picture emerging of nodal pollution, and some of it is coming from those chronic spills, which are from those factory sites. Some of it is coming from acute spills, which might be a shipping incident. But this isn't all of the nurdles that there are out there in the world. Or even though about 90% of nurdle hunts are finding nurdles, we know that there's many more out there. Over 6,000 hunts have taken place, and these have been run by volunteers, but volunteers can't get everywhere, and they certainly can't find all of the nurdles. So we know that there's more places that are at risk from nodal pollution, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to map the global plastic pellet supply chain, to see all of those points of industry and to see where else might be at risk. We also wanted to map the plastic pellet supply chain because we think it can support some of the solutions. There are things that can be done to stop plastic pellet pollution. So we can have legislation to make sure that there is a supply chain approach taken, and there are measures in place to stop pellets escaping. We can classify pellets as hazardous so that they're labelled properly and stowed properly when they're on ships. We can also try and reduce plastic use and demand, and we will need to increase some reuse and recycling, but we need measures in place to make sure that that recycling isn't contaminating the plastic, and that pellet control measures are equally in place at recycling sites. So there's lots of different solutions out there, and we've been advocating for many of these, along with NGOs around the world. And this is where we've developed the hub, and the link to the hub is in the chat. So we've developed, as well as the nurdle hunt, we've developed this hub of information for NGOs around the world to share the solutions that they're working on. If you've got reports or images that you think could be helpful and that you're happy for us to link to, then please do let us know, and we can add those onto the hub as well. So we're really trying to make sure that there's both national, local and global solutions out there. So why did we want to map the global plastic pellet supply chain? Well, plastic pellets are a big issue already, and we're worried that it's going to get worse. But I think, as well as wanting to support NGOs and working on this issue, really one of the reasons why we wanted to map the global plastic pellet supply chain is because of this, because over 2 trillion plastic pellets are released into the environment across the world annually, and this is set to grow. This means there are countries and sites, including protected areas, fisheries, places that are important for tourism, for people's livelihoods, important for people's culture and well-being, that are all being impacted by nurdles right now. And if we don't do something to stop plastic pellets, this is going to get worse. So that's why we wanted to map the global plastic pellet supply chain, and why we asked Oracle Environmental Experts to help us with that. So I'm now going to hand over to Josh and Sam from Oracle Environmental Experts to tell us how they went about this mapping, some of the key findings, and some of the specific sites and case studies that they've uncovered. Over to you, Sam and Josh.
Brilliant, thanks Heather. I think Sam's going to share the screen, and I'll give him a nod when we change the slides. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so basically, yeah, to go on to ourselves at Oracle Environmental, we're an environmental consultancy who deal with pollution instances across the UK and Northern Ireland, and along with Spill Association and Plastic Pollution Working Group, for the last sort of 2 years, we've started really looking into plastic pollution and kind of all its forms, and trying to identify the extent of the issue, and also how we can help with that, and especially from the response side. And then obviously we've then worked with Fidra recently to look at again, trying to highlight the issue on the supply chain. So the work was undertaken by myself and Sam Perkins, and also our MD John Burton, and our contact details will be on the end page as well. So the key questions that we really wanted to address on this are sort of listed here. And again, it is looking at the sort of the holistic approach from the full lifetime cycle, in reality, of plastics. Of firstly, how big is the issue across the globe and on that plastic supply chain? Where are these transport routes? Where is the plastic being moved around? And then looking at how that can vary regionally with industry growth, and also those importers and exporters. So as I mentioned, sort of how we're moving those primary plastics across the globe, and then coming onto the side of the pollution and the scale. And it's something that obviously the work that Fidra have definitely highlighted with the nodal mapping. We can sort of basically unpick that a little bit more with the acute and chronic spills that we've identified so far. And then sort of going into how that pollution might change in the future, especially with increasing industry, and where the pollution is coming from, so we can kind of make inferences on those potential sources, what is being done to tackle pellet pollution, and then what more needs to be done going forwards, and hopefully with yourselves as NGOs, and be the ones really driving that. So yeah, next one then please, Sam. So how big is the global plastic supply chain? It's big. Basically, we're looking in 2021, the industry produced 39 million tons of plastic. And to put that into scale for you, so if your average 500 milliliter plastic bottle weighs about 25 grams. And in 2021, the world population was 7.88 billion people. Now that's enough plastic to give everyone 1,979 plastic bottles each, which is the same weight as 65 Great Pyramids of Giza. So, everyone has plastic in their households, and it really does illustrate how big this issue is. So this is where I'll sort of pass on to Sam, who will unpick a bit more onto the data, and then I'll pick it up at the end on acute and chronic spills.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm going to look a little bit more now in sort of where is the global plastic supply chain. So it felt like a bit of a mammoth task when we first started looking at this to try and work out sort of where to get this data from. So we started out looking at things, looking at sort of the big multinational petrochemical companies initially, and lots of these companies have our location sections on their websites, and we were able to sort of start there. And then we moved on to looking at trade directories to see whether we could access any information from there. And then we also looked at things like industry classification codes. So for the UK, for example, we looked at specific code which classify the plastics industry, and how that was sort of and what information the central government held on those. And in the United States, we used data from the US EPA, which held data on sort of emissions from plastic industry. So in terms of where is the global plastic supply chain, as it suggests, it is global. So in 2021, 143 countries imported plastic in its primary form. So this is likely to be in the form of pellets, flakes, powders. So that's 73% of all countries in the world. And out of those, 123 countries also exported plastics in a primary form. So we tried to map the locations of the facilities who were producing these pellets, who were manufacturing these pellets into products, or who had sort of an intermediary role, like a master batcher who might be adding color to the pellets or adding other chemicals to the pellets to enhance its properties. So we're acutely aware this is not a definitive map, so there will be some gaps. So one sort of key area where we know there's a massive plastics industry is the Asia Pacific region, sort of notably China. So we do have a gap there. So we found that the data wasn't always available or accessible, and for various reasons. Sometimes this was sort of a language barrier, or it was we found that there was data available on large trade directories, but the cost of obtaining that data was just thousands, if not tens of thousands of euros. So it was some of it just wasn't available for certain areas. So then we also had a little look at which countries were the major players in the global plastic supply chain. So we took 19 different commodity codes for primary plastics that we knew would be related to plastic pellets. So we've got the top 10 importers on the graph on the left there, and no big surprise, China was the biggest importer of primary plastics in 2021. You turn over pretty much any plastic product that you've got, and 9 times out of 10, it's probably stamped "Made in China" on the back of it. So slightly surprising there for myself was Germany being the second biggest importer. And you'll note there as well that we've got various other countries in Europe featuring in that top 10. And if you move over to the right and look at the exporters, it's the United States, sort of fairly closely followed by Saudi Arabia, who are the top two exporters of plastic. So this is based on trade value in billions of US dollars, as opposed to mass of plastic. This was taken from the World Bank database, and there were some gaps with the masses. So we've gone for trade value instead there. So a little look at how this industry varies regionally. So we've looked there at sort of specific countries. So these arrows represent the imports that are going into the region and then the exports coming out of the region. So for North America, you've got sort of they account for 11% of the imports of primary plastics and 17% of the exports. But by far, Europe is the region with the most imports and exports there, with accounting for 40% of global imports and 35% of exports. So that's closely followed by the Asia Pacific region. So this kind of gives you a feel for how the industry is split across the globe. So if you think back to the first map we showed, this where we had a lot of activity in Europe. That kind of correlates with these figures, but then what we were showing in the Asia Pacific region, where we didn't have a huge number of sites mapped, that doesn't really correlate with the percentages that we've got there. So that sort of clearly highlights that there is that gap in the data for finding sites in that region. So let's break it down a little bit more regionally. So we split the world into 5 regions, as shown in the previous map. So in 2021, North America accounted for 17% of global plastic production. So the map there, all of the red points are facilities that we've identified as being involved in the plastic industry. So some of these are producers, master batchers, manufacturers, and recyclers. We've also mapped on the locations of any positive Noodle hunts we found. So this is a combination of the data that Fidra have collected and also Noodle Patrol's data as well. We've also mapped on the large ports because we know that shipping and transport can be a source of pollution as well. So a few more points of scale. So within the USA, there's over 1 million people employed in the plastics industry. As we saw in the previous graph, they're the largest exporter of primary plastics. And then elsewhere in the region, you've got Canada was the 11th largest importer and exporter, with Mexico being the 7th largest importer and the 33rd largest exporter as well. So taking a look at the US map there, you've got quite a concentration of noodles in the Gulf of Mexico, which does again correlate with quite a large concentration of industry in the same region. So if we move on and have a little look at Europe, which we know there was again quite accounted for quite a large percentage of imports and exports. So the European Union in 2021, so not all of Europe, accounted for 15% of world plastic production, and within that block there is 1.5 million people employed in the plastics industry. So you've got in Europe 4 of the world's top 10 exporters and 5 of the world's top 10 importers of primary plastics. So it's a really key area for plastic manufacture and production. And then you've got Germany being the world's 2nd largest importer, and And if you look on the map there, you've clearly got a very high concentration of plastic facilities in Germany, which would correlate with the figures that we found there. Obviously, we've got an awful lot of Noodles shown around the coast of the UK. Sort of credit to Fidra's efforts in sort of correlating those, and it'd be lovely if we could expand that over time to Europe and the wider world as well. So we'll take a look at Africa and the Middle East, and we've kind of left Europe on the top of this map here, just to try and show the sort of stark difference between the two. So we've certainly got a lot fewer facilities that we've identified, but looking back at that regional divide, then the percentages of imports and exports would correlate with that, to show that you probably do have a smaller industry there. So with this region accounted for 8% of world plastic production in 2021, with Nigeria being the largest importer within Africa, and Egypt being the largest exporter. And then Saudi Arabia was the world's second largest exporter of plastics in primary forms in 2021 there. So we do have quite a lot of Noodles along the south coast of South Africa there, but there is certainly some industry that I think is slightly covered by some of those. But we know that we've got acute spills in that region, which Josh will talk about a little bit more later on. So Central and South America, again, slightly smaller fraction of the plastics industry here. So only 4% of world plastic production in 2021. So it looks like the majority of that can be attributed to Brazil being the largest importer and exporter in the region, with Colombia then being the second largest exporter. And then onto the Asia Pacific region. So here we've got over half of the world's plastic production was in this region in 2021, with China being the largest importer of primary plastics. So out of that 52% in the region, China accounted for 32% of that. So almost a third of world plastic production came out of China. And then also within this region, you've got South Korea being the world's third largest exporter, and then Singapore, the world's fifth largest exporter. So you've got a lot of plastics being moved around sort of within this region, and then outside of this region as well. So I think what's notable here is that China sort of has that almost a third of plastic production, but we've got that real sort of gap in the number of sites that we've been able to identify within China there. So it's certainly some work for the future to try and sort of fill that little void there if we can. So we identified that there were there's all this billions of dollars of trade in primary plastics between all these different regions. So then we took a little bit more of a look at how these are moved around the globe. So these inter-regional movements are primarily by container ship, where there's no sort of viable road route between them. So to take you through a little example that we did. So we looked at China as the world's biggest importer of primary plastics. So we looked at one single commodity code. So we looked at propylene and polypropylene polymers. So in 2021, the biggest exporters of the top three exporters of that commodity code to China were South Korea, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. So there's obviously no viable road route between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Eastern China. So we can be pretty confident that this is going to be coming by ship. So we started to look at the sort of primary shipping routes between these regions. So we went onto the websites of some of the very large container shipping companies, and here's an example of one of their routes that goes between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Eastern China. So we know that there was over 750,000 tons of just that one commodity code moved within 1 year, potentially along this route. So what we've highlighted with the dark blue markers there are acute spills, which just map quite nicely onto this route. So we've got Hong Kong there in 2012, Sri Lanka 2021, Dubai early 2023, and then the pellets being washed up on the beaches in Mumbai only a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, that was quite interesting to see those mapping very closely along that route. So the other thing we looked at on this route, so the countries that are highlighted in pink are countries that have quite a high proportion of their GDP coming from tourism. So these countries may be sort of more adversely affected than others if spills were to occur very close to them, sort of as we saw with Sri Lanka in 2021. So it's an example of sort of an activity that could be undertaken in other regions where we can look at these major movements of plastics, look at other incidents that happen along the routes, and then also look at some of the sort of really sensitive receptors. So in this case, we've just looked at tourism, but you could take this into more detail and look at protected areas and fishing as well, just to sort of highlight some of the risks of moving this material around by ship. So once it comes off the ships, it then is going to get moved terrestrially, moved on land. So I thought this was quite an interesting example of how things may get moved around in the United States. So they have a big intermodal transport network. So this is where things get moved between maritime transport and road and rail. And some of these intermodal depots inland are enormous. So this one's 2.8 kilometers long and covers 2.6 square kilometers. So there's the image on the right shows a zoom in. So each one of those is a 40-foot shipping container. And you look back at the image on the left, and you've pretty much got a row of 40-foot shipping containers about 2.5 kilometers long. So the numbers are just staggering. Obviously, these aren't going to all have plastics in them, but looking at the quantity of plastics that are manufactured in the US, then there's a good chance that there's quite a lot of plastic pellets in that image. And these movements inland as well are also sort of key potential sources for spills. And at some of these depots, they undertake some operations which are often called stripping and stuffing. So these containers may be emptied in some of these sites and moved onto lorries or packaged in different ways. So they're sort of a potential key inland source for pollution as well. So a little look at the current scale of pellet pollution. So we looked at some figures that were available for pellet pollution in Europe, and then we've extrapolated those based on the market share for each of the 5 regions that we looked at. So globally, as Heather touched on before, we're looking at somewhere between 2.2 and 22.4 trillion pellets being lost to the environment each year. So there's 1 trillion there. So that's 1 and 12 zeros after it. So it's kind of a bit of a hard number to get your head around. So the graph there shows that the prediction that the majority of those pellet losses are going to be coming from Europe and the Asia Pacific region based on our analysis of the market share of imports and exports for those regions. So if we were to try and sort of get our head around some of these numbers, so based on a Noodle being sort of, as Heather said, the size of a lentil, maybe 3 millimeters, so those 22.4 trillion pellets would cover over 22,000 football pitches. So an absolutely huge area if you laid those pellets out. So we'll have a look at the current scale of pellet pollution. So what we've mapped here is some of this data is what Heather showed earlier, the Fidra's data, and we've also got some Noodle Patrol data in here as well. So we again got quite a sort of clear correlation between where we saw industry and also where we're seeing these pellets. But again, we've got these gaps in the sort of Asia Pacific region. So there's very few reported over there. So this is either the industry isn't there that's causing the pollution, which we know isn't the case, or they're just being very, very, very neat and tidy, and there's no pollution happening. So I think we can probably guess the answer to that one. So then we could think about how might this pellet pollution change going forward. So this graph shows the sort of minimum and maximum projections of global pellet loss. So this is the previous bar graph, just all put together. So this is based on the plastics industry not changing, so not getting any bigger, but also no action being taken to mitigate it. So we're suggesting between 450,000 and 4.5 million tons of pellets could be lost between 2021 and 2030. Although it is projected that the plastics industry will triple by 2060. So these numbers could also triple. So if this is very much the industry staying the same, which are still massive numbers. But yeah, if the industry triples, then this is going to get even worse. So now I'll hand back to Josh to take you through where might the pollution be coming from.
Nice one, thanks, Sam. And yeah, I think we all agree that it's been quite something, kind of hearing those numbers in the trillions, and it's kind of makes you really think about how much plastic is being produced. So the question then leads on to, where is this pollution coming from when we are finding it in the environment? And all those fantastic surveys and volunteer-led programs of cleaning this pollution up is trying to stop it from the source. Ultimately, we'd much prefer not to clean those beaches. So what we've represented here is the sort of density of industries within these regions. And again, as you can see from those other figures, there are these key hotspot areas, especially from the US and then within Europe as well. And then what we've done is overlaid that information that we have from the Nodal Patrol and Nodal Hunt data, and you can see that relationship between those. Obviously, from here, it begs the question, is this pollution coming from industry and those transport routes directly? So on to the next point, and what is quite nice to show here, and Sam, if you just go back and forth these slides, because they do slightly overlay. So what we have then looked into is the acute and chronic spills that have been reported. So these large instances and also chronic spill sites where there's vast amounts of pollution on shorelines or in areas year on year. And again, those overlay with where we're finding high densities of industry, and also again those reported instances. So since 1995, so since 1995, there's been 41 reported acute spills across the globe, and those are represented here on those dark blue markers. Now, these range from the smaller, lesser known roadside lorry spills, largely so far reported within France, to freight derailments within the USA, but also plastic pellet bags washing up on the beaches of Mumbai and Dubai. But this also is the large instances, which probably everyone already knows about, involving container losses from that global shipping trade, such as 2 instances we've had down in South Africa, and then the largest one obviously being Sri Lanka, losing billions of pellets within minutes. But as well, we have got the continued loss, as we've mentioned beforehand, over years from the mismanagement of industry within the manufacturing, production and storage of pellets. So since 2005, there have been 31 reported chronic spill sites represented as these yellow markers. Now, these are sites that we have identified there to be a large amount of pellets sort of on an annual basis. But this doesn't represent the chronic loss of that of pellets being lost during transport, which might spread vast distances, not strictly accumulating in one location. And as you can probably tell, much like the other data we found sort of within our research, there are a lot of data gaps, and this is probably likely a vast underestimate of the true extent of pollution across the globe. Now, this does come from poor transparency within the industry, not reporting these instances, but as well, there is also that due to the international spread, there's that language barrier. So certain key terms like pellets and noodles don't always flag up when we've been doing the searches. So obviously off the back of this, is there anyone is aware, once you've had a good look through the report, of any more cases of acute or chronic sites, please do get in touch, and we can basically start building this database, making it sort of a definitive list of all the recorded instances. So going on from this, we looked at further detail. 2 sites in particular, one looking at the chronic side and basically the loss from industry. So this example of chronic pollution is a nature reserve and site-specific scientific interest in Chesil Bay in Southampton. Now, the pollution has been identified since 2011 and is still ongoing at this site, which is a protected mudflat for resident bird populations. So the red markers on this map here show the manufacturing sites within the area, and along this sort of.
Sorry, Josh. Occasionally you're dropping out. You've just gone very quiet. You keep coming back in, but maybe if you could, I don't know whether it's when you're moving or whether it's
Okay.
your microphone.
I don't know if it's in a bit closer. If that's any better.
That's a bit better. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I'll still a little bit closer. So what we've got on this map here are those red markers showing the industry, and then the blue markers using the Noodle hunt data showing where there's presence of pellets. And the hatched green area is the Chesil Bay Nature Reserve, and we can see sort of that high density of pellets identified within that area. So local NGO groups such as Surface Sewage have since identified spilt pellets on the storage areas within gullies of these manufacturing areas, which could be the potential source of this pollution from runoff into drains or directly sort of wind-blown transport into the river. So the second one we looked at was an acute loss in Hong Kong back in 2012 from the shipping trade. So this was a loss of 6 containers overboard following a sort of Category 4 typhoon. So each container was thought to have about 1,000 25-kilogram bags each, leading to a potential loss of 150 tons, which is equivalent to 7.5 billion pellets into the oceans. So local NGO Plastic Free Seas were one of the first to identify these pellets, and thousands of volunteers were on the beaches across Hong Kong cleaning up the shorelines. So as you can see from those black markers, those are all the recorded places where they had found these pellets, and it stretched as far as Macau, right to the west there as well. The green areas on this map show the numerous national designations and protected areas within Hong Kong for endangered nesting green turtle populations, and also the coral reefs in the area. Off the back of this as well, there was sort of a number of concerns with human health from the release of contaminants from these pellets, potentially entering the food chain from consumption of fish, which in turn have eaten these pellets due to their small size, thinking they may well be fish eggs. Given Hong Kong's size of over 200 islands, again, the true extent of this is probably unknown, and pellets were seen to be washing up on shorelines for months on end, and even in 2019 there's still been recorded sort of identification of pellets, which may well have resulted from that spill, but as well could be from sort of chronic losses from the transport. And again, this is just 2 of those 78 reported acute and chronic spills, and I imagine everyone will have an example of these incidences which you could look into more detail yourself and have far-reaching and ongoing impacts. So from this, we looked into what is currently being done to tackle pellet pollution. So as you know, with Fidra and the Noodle patrol data, this is a fantastic way to illustrate the issue, to highlight this to the public, and then hopefully influence policymakers and change in the future. What we obviously need to do is try and fill those data gaps and see, even if there isn't any pellets identified, that's brilliant. It's showing that we the extent of that issue from there. Within the industry side, what's currently being done is there are volunteer sort of pledges, such as Operation Clean Sweep, which individual companies can sign up to pledge that they're going to commit to zero pellet loss, improving their handling and storage. However, obviously this is only a voluntary scheme, and they're sort of, I think we look into the percentages, but a sort of handful of these companies are signed up to this. One of the world's first pellet handling specifications, PAS 510, was published in 2021 by the British Standards Industry to enact that mandatory change, and hopefully we're we'll see the benefits from that. But going on from that, as if you go to the next one, please, Sam. Really, we need to highlight what more needs to be done, because we are still finding those losses. In the instances of Chesil Bay, we're still seeing virgin fresh plastics being released into the environment. So one that many of you will know of is work is being put together to complete a draft global legally binding agreement in the form of the Plastic Global Treaty, Global Plastics Treaty for 2024. And this is looking to address the full lifetime cycle of plastics and shift to alternative materials, which will obviously benefit and, with any luck, slow that increase of the industry. As well, the IMO are looking at reclassifying pellets as something Heather touched on, with designating these as environmentally hazardous. So the benefits of this will include lead to better stowage on ships, with the hope that they less will be lost overboard. And then if there were any instances, there'd be more accurate and timely information produced, so a rapid response can be put in place, and hopefully that will come in again in the next few years. But overall, there needs to be an improvement in sort of on the industry level, looking at transparency, trying to report when there have been losses. Now in France, that was something that was enacted a few years ago, and that's why we're seeing such high reports of acute spills from road instances in France. And if that can be implemented, across the globe, we will really get a true understanding of the issue, and more things will be put in place to minimise that going forwards. So looking at that, a sort of supply chain approach from there on in, and ultimately turning off the tap at the source. So that is everything from our side of things at the moment. Again, here are sort of our contact details. So please have a good look through the report. If you've got any questions, do get in touch with us. We're more happy to help sort of ourselves and Fidra on everything from there. If there's anything else more really for you to add, and Sam and Heather and Danny, please feel free.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh and Sam, for talking us through some of those key findings. There really is some really quite shocking information in there, both about the scale of the industry, how widespread it is, and how many pellets are being lost, and that they are getting into protected areas, that they have impacted fishing, that there's been concerns about health. And I think a lot of the people on this call will have their own stories about how pellet pollution has impacted them and their communities and their environment. So it's great to see some of these stories coming to light, but I know that we couldn't include them all. And as well as thanking you both for this work, I wanted to thank all of the people that have done Noodle hunts. As you can see, this mapping work, we wouldn't be able to draw some of these correlations between the Noodle finds and the industry without all of those data points. And the work of NGOs working on some of these solutions, highlighting the issue and sharing their insights in putting this report together. It wouldn't have been possible without all the hard work that goes on from NGOs and communities around the world. So it's been really, really great to see that information being pulled together and is starting to build this global picture. One of the things that struck me from what you were saying and from the report was that there are data gaps, which I think probably a lot of us were expecting. But even with those data gaps, we're still able to see that the vast scale of the plastic industry, we're able to see that there are thousands of pollution sites, some of which are acute and at very high numbers of pellets washing up at one time, some of which are chronic. But even without the full data set, we're already getting a really shocking picture of pellet pollution. So I wanted to open it up to questions. We've had a couple of questions in the chat already. So I will start with that one. We had a question around whether there was a distinction between the recycled and the virgin pellets. Can I ask that to you, Sam?
So in terms of if we were looking at the imports and exports, that was all virgin pellets. So we did, there was a separate commodity code which we did start to look at, which was for waste plastics from industry. So this would be the kind of things like offcuts from plastic molds, that kind of thing. So we weren't able to find any sort of reliable large enough data sets for the recycled pellets. So the most of what the data that's presented there is, or all of the data in terms of the imports and exports is are virgin plastics.
Great, thank you. So yes, I know that when you were mapping the sites of recycling sites, that there was far fewer at the moment, but that was one of the concerns, that there may be more plastic recycling sites in the future, and those could be future sources of pellet loss. That's really useful. We're also getting into the chat, examples from other people's, like about the Sri Lanka spill and the impacts that that's having. Stories from here in the Firth of Forth about how we can hold industry to account as well. And I think we'll come back to that question, because I think that's a really important one for us all to reflect on, about how we can hold industry to account on this. So I'm going to put that to everybody, but come back to it in a minute, because I think we could talk about that for the rest of the session. I'm going to go to you, Amy, because I can see that you've raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I do, if that's all right. And first, like, this report is super interesting and I think really valuable to those of us that are in policy. And I think like there's a lot of great direct correlations between ambition and those big exporters or importers. But I have two questions. The first one's pretty brief, but is the disparity between like the regional density of imports and exports more about data gaps, or would you say just like that there's a lack of imports and exports in those areas? And then the second one was whether or not the research shows flag state jurisdiction on shipping for pellets lost. So for example, like I assume that China's a big exporter, so a lot of those exporting pellets would be Chinese vessels. But for those that have smaller fleets, maybe those in Europe, are different state vessels responsible for spills? Or is there, like, if you have looked at this, is there any trends about like who the big violators are, if that's reflected the same flag state jurisdiction with the exporting states? Or maybe you haven't looked at that at all, but just curious for IMO stuff. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. I think Sam might be able to answer the first part of the question. The second part of the question, I think, was a little bit too detailed for this particular study, but I think that's a really interesting point of who actually is responsible for these vessels that are moving around. But Sam, did you want to answer the first part of Amy's question?
Sure. So the data on the imports and exports came from a World Bank website, the World Integrated Trade Solution. So that does give trade data for every country, essentially. So I think we could be quite confident that the where we've looked at the trade, that we've kind of captured the world. Some of the other figures we've presented in terms of percentages of plastic production in those regions would then sort of encompass what stays within a country. So there will obviously be within the US, for example, they'll be producing a lot of plastic pellets, but a large number of those will also not necessarily be leaving the US. They may be staying there and being manufactured into products in there as well. So that might be something which isn't really captured in that, which isn't captured in that import-export data. So it was particularly the US and the UK which we found it easiest to identify these the production sites within those countries. So I think that's another sort of an area for future exploration is looking at where plastics sort of remain within within that region or within that country, and yeah, have the potential losses from a sort of internal supply chain, national level rather than an international level.
And to quickly, loosely answer that second one, as mentioned, I think what we've highlighted from this is a million more reports we could be doing and research. It's just trying to find the time to do it. But interestingly, from the Hong Kong case study, which is so those two case studies are in the appendices of the report. What basically came of that was that there was a bit of argument that the people responsible for the pellets had chartered the vessel, and there was a bit of argument on kind of, oh, well, who's responsible, and it's your losses. And I mean, in the end, they did actually set aside, I think it was $1.28 million US dollars to help with the cleanup effort. I think obviously, yeah, there needs to be that responsibility to so the polluter pays ultimately if there's been a loss. I know in the Sri Lanka incident as well, a lot of these containers will have insurances. So it's the vessel will have insurance. Then the contents of those containers will have their own separate insurances. So there's a lot of, not so much finger pointing, but I think that needs to be looked into definitely more. And you said sort of on a global scale as well. So it's really interesting question.
Thank you for that. We've also had a question around figure 9 in the report, but I think it's also generally worth clarifying about the report itself, is whether we're showing petrochemical plants or only plastic manufacturing facilities. And I think the answer to that, but do correct me if I'm misunderstood this, is that really in this report, the whole sort of plastic pellet supply chain has been looked at. So it's often petrochemical plants that are producing the pellets in the first instance, and then manufacturing sites that are converting those pellets into plastic products. So the petrochemical plants that are producing the Noodles will be included in this study. However, a petrochemical site that is maybe making an additive that is transported as a solution wouldn't be in this study. It would just be the ones that are producing the pellets. Is that a clear distinction, Sam? Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So that was the sort of first place we went to sort of, we started at the beginning of the supply chain at those petrochemical sites, and we went to some of the biggest multinational companies, and as I mentioned before, went to their sort of location pages, and then filtered through, sort of taking out their office locations and their R&D locations, and then when we identified an individual site, we went through the description of what that site produced to make sure that that site was producing polymers before we included it in the report. But then we do also then have the manufacturing facilities and the recycling facilities. So I've just had a quick look at figure 9 again, and yes, that is sort of those three is the primary three that are on there. So the sort of petrochemical site producing the sort of raw Noodles, manufacturing sites converting those to products, and then the recycling sites converting those products back to Noodles.
Great, thank you. We also had a question earlier about the figures of over 2 trillion to over 22 trillion pellets being lost. Would it be worth sort of spending a bit more time explaining how that figure came about? I mean, I know you showed the graph as well, but actually that was a piece of sort of useful research, wasn't it? It was a good bit of data to have uncovered.
Yeah, so that was data that so we basically took data for Europe that had been published by Eunomia. So looking at the number of pellets that had been potentially lost for the European region. As part of then our assessment of the sort of global share of the plastics industry, we then extrapolated that out to the other regions based on the percentages of the share. So that's where and Eunomia sort of published data showing a minimum and a maximum, and then we extrapolated out both the minimum and the maximum. So that's where your sort of minimum loss is the 2 trillion globally, and then it's the 22.4 trillion, which is the sort of maximum. So I think yeah, looking at the questions, so is they good peer review data to support it? It's not necessarily. It's kind of taking an estimate and then expanding on that. But I think, as we've highlighted in this report, that there's sort of that real lack of transparency from industry. So I think ever being able to put a really definitive number on something like this is just going to be incredibly difficult, unless everybody puts their hands up to every time they have a spill, which we know just doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I thought it was an interesting way to try and get that answer for the taking what Eunomia had done in Europe, the information that you'd found out about the trade and how big a percentage of plastic trade that was, and then extrapolating the figures of loss in Europe to, well, if North America were losing a similar amount of Noodles, what would that be? So it was a really good way of getting around that. I can see that we're asking for the sort of the information on that.
Source
so
report.
we've got the report is the report that we've just published today. So we'll put the link in the chat again. So
yeah, it's one of the references in the report that's gone up today. But I can share that directly with you as well, Mark, if you'd like.
Yeah, the Eunomia report is in there. So you'll find that the 2.2 to 22.4 trillion figure there in our report. So I wanted to spend the last couple of minutes of basically reflecting back on one of those questions and open it up to the whole floor about how can we use this report to hold industry to account? How can we use these stories and case studies? Not all of them have made it into the report. We couldn't cover every single incident, but how you might want to use this report or do your own studies to make some of these changes that we need to see in the plastic pellet supply chain. So I want to open it up to all of you of what you thought about the report, about how we can use evidence like this or your own evidence to hold industry to account on some of these issues. Ideas welcome.
My name is Mark Orr, and I work with Josh in the Plastic Pollution Working Group of the UK and Ireland Spill Association. So these are topics which are very close to our group's members' hearts, and also as a spill response organisation, our members see the end product of these spills and the harm that they cause, but also the difficulty that we have in eradicating them from the environment, in that they very rarely completely go away. And I'm sure that there'll be Noodles washing up in Sri Lanka or Dubai or wherever there's been a significant spill for many, many years to come. So their persistence within the environment and the harm that they continue to cause by that persistence will go on for many, many decades after the original spill. So preventing the spill is absolutely at the essence of everything. And unfortunately, it seems very, very hard to get governments to tackle the issue in a regulatory or enforcement way. And until they do, all you can do is to try to persuade industry to act responsibly. And the industries that we probably need to target are firstly the oil companies that produce them, and to lobby their shareholders and their investors to have a much stronger corporate social responsibility towards the products that they generate, and to the manufacturers of the plastic products for them to adopt some of the protocols which they know and are aware of through things like Operation Clean Sweep, plastic carriage of plastic. There's a publicly accessible standard which is being produced by the British Plastics Federation, trying to urge their members to manage manage losses within the supply chain. But until we can lobby their shareholders and their investors to effect control, the companies themselves aren't going to act, because to act means that they've got to change the way that they're used to working, and to change the way they're used to working costs money, because we will not get government support to do it, because government has got a light touch to regulation of those industries. So really we need to lobby hard, and we need to share the knowledge which this report contains as widely as possible. journalists have a really good way of creating influence, and there are journalists who would take this and they would use it wisely. But there are also journalists who will also take it and they'll be staggered at the claims which are made. And so that's why I was asking the question about the source for 2 trillion or 22.4 trillion pellets being lost. The sources have to be really solid, because otherwise otherwise the report will then be accused of over dramatizing the issue. And you'd have seen the little LinkedIn storm that's been going on this week about a New York Times article saying that there's not as much plastic going into the seas as we thought, and then the response being that, oh well, she's probably paid by the oil industry to say things like that. But it is being published in the New York Times, so you'd like to think that what she's saying has got some robust support to it.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's a really good point, that, and this is why we wanted to make sure this report was robust and all the sources and data sources are there, and you can use that to create your own maps, your own conclusions. So I think there's some really good points in there about the need for regulation, and until we get regulation, lobbying, and working with investors and some of the people that sell these products. I think there's some really good suggestions in there. Joe, did you have a comment?
Yeah, hello. Hi, Mark. I just heard what you said, and it all makes total sense about prevention, etc. So we're on the other side where we're now dealing. So I'm on the first fourth, and on the side opposite over from Grangemouth and further down. Our community and all the generations of children here growing up with nurdles falling out of the sandbanks on the beaches. Every time a high tide comes in, they're being washed up, dragged up from the bottom of the Firth of Forth. And so I sit here hearing all about prevention, and I think, well, that's fine. But like you say, there's trillions of them still sitting in the sea and causing problems and accumulating toxins. And they're also sitting on our beaches where children are playing, almost like children have accepted that that's part of their life, that's what their beach is like. It has loads of nurdles on it and no one's doing anything about it. So therefore they're growing up in an environment where no one is being taking responsibility for it, and they're learning that that's okay. So we as a group where we are starting to look at trying to track down all the companies who've been working in the Firth of Forth with nurdles, however many decades it goes back, freedom of information, everything else. And we're going to write to every single one and we're going to tell them what we are dealing with. But what I wanted to know was whether anyone else has ever done anything like this around the world and, you know, tackled historical pollution. Obviously, legally, there's not much that would hold up in court potentially till one day we might have an environmental court. But essentially, is there any examples where anyone has held people historically to account for what's happened in decades before around the world? Does anyone know that?
Great question. Is there anyone?
Josh, do you want to touch on Chesil Beach?
Yeah, I mean, so one really is that case study from Chesil Bay.
You've gone a bit quiet again, Josh. Sorry.
Can you repeat yourself? Sorry.
Not sure if it's my camera. Is that any better?
Yeah, it's all right. Just be a bit closer. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So so one example is Chesil Bay. Now I think they're still not there yet with holding them accountable, but the issues have been reported to the Environment Agency sort of several times, using that information from the Noodle hunt data. Now the EA apparently have gone there and suggested ways of implementing it and saying that, okay, you need to make sure XYZ is being done. The issue is that obviously there's still a loss. From my understanding, what is happening now is that they're trying to create a stakeholder group to include those industries in, to then make them accountable. There has been cleanup efforts on Chesil Bay, and again, that's sort of detailed in the report. It's something that ourselves as Oracle as well are sort of going to hopefully get more involved in going forwards. But to date, they haven't paid for anything because they're sort of denying responsibility. Given the amount of manufacturers in that area, they're just pointing blame to someone else. So there's a question mark of traceability of kind of trying to track back who was responsible, and whether that is something that will come into play with maybe markers on plastics, but obviously the value placed on them is so low, they're not, the likelihood is they're not going to want to do that because you're just making it something more expensive. So yeah, one example is Chesil Bay, slowly getting there, and they have gone to these manufacturers. So they've taken that first step. With any luck going forwards, they might get more involved. But again, obviously, if anyone else knows of any more, please let us know.
Josh, could I get a contact detail for whoever's leading on that kind of stakeholder engagement down there?
Yeah, if you send me across an email, and then what I can do is I've tried long and hard to try and work out who the lead is.
Okay.
We'll make sure that you're in touch, Joe, because
Thank you.
I think the Environment Agency there have helped, but when you don't have a regulator that's willing to get involved, it is more difficult.
Yeah, tell me better.
Yeah, so I think we need to start wrapping up now, but I know we could keep talking about this, and in fact, if you would like to keep talking about this, at 4 o'clock today, myself, my colleagues Danny and Jamie, who are also on the call, will be available for answering questions. So please do join us. We'll be putting up the YouTube recording and the link is in the chat there. I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that one of the solutions that we think might help and that came up in today's presentation is the Global Plastics Treaty, which is open for submissions at the moment until the 15th of August to inform the next round of negotiations, the third round of negotiations. We're keen to see that pellets are addressed in that, and we've put together our own submission. And if you are doing a submission or would like to do a submission to the UN on this Global Plastics Treaty, then please do have a look at our submission and feel free to borrow bits from it to put in on Noodles if you wanted to include anything on that. So this is already one of the reasons why we wanted to do this report, and is certainly one of the references that we're using in that submission. So I think we'll have to close the meeting there. Please do keep emailing in questions, and maybe see some of you at 4 o'clock today. And thank you ever so much for coming to this. Thank you for your inputs into the report itself, whether that's from doing Noodle hunts, talking about the issue, sharing your stories or images of Noodle pollution. It's helped build up this picture. We know we haven't been able to cover absolutely everything, and we know that there are huge data gaps still to fill. But I think what we have shown is that this is a global problem, and it's potentially much worse than we're able to illustrate at the moment. But even just looking at what we've got so far, there's more than enough reason to take further action. So good luck to you all in your efforts in tackling plastic pollution. Thank you to you all for everything you're doing on that. And I look forward to talking more with you about how we can make this pollution a thing of the past. Thank you.